Today, I want to talk a little bit about responsive web design. And when I say responsive web design, I mean responsive web development, which are kind of used interchangeably, but we're going to talk about the building part. When you build a website, the old way to do it, so like when we read the Mobile First book, there used to be originally like M.dot websites. You go to a website and it would be like M.dot, and that would be the mobile version of the website. Everyone else got the desktop version of the website. Then it's sort of, they introduce these things called breakpoints and media queries where you don't have to have a completely cell phone specific version of the website, and your website can sort of grow from one version to the other version of the site. And a lot of folks did those with very specific breakpoints. So you'd be like, all cell phones are roughly this many pixels, all tablets are roughly this many pixels, and this many pixels means it's a desktop. Because of the gigantic speed at which our technology has grown, it is nearly impossible, especially with Retina screens and many different size tablets, to know now what the user is actually on, whether they're on a tablet or a desktop or a Chromebook or an iPad mini or a Thunderbolt or their 4K TV, all kinds of devices. So our goal in building the web is no longer to serve specific devices such as like a mobile, tablet, desktop view of the website, and more just try and make the website look as good as possible on any screen size. I'm going to share a few examples if you want. I'm going to use the inspector to resize this window. This is our beautiful Sparkbox website. And it looks pretty amazing on small screens, if I do say so myself. Let's go to the homepage. This website, you'll notice it doesn't have like a mobile tablet breakpoint, and the components will get larger when they start to look bad. So if we slowly move this forward, you'll see watch these three elements here. Right, so they break here. And this is a breakpoint because when we want the design to be 3 across, let me find the exact pixel. Right there. Crap. So this long text right here doesn't fit if this box gets any smaller. So that's where we decided to make the breakpoint, right? And then it will grow larger as we move. When we get to Philip, are these like browser VH fonts? I think.
If it's growing a bit, it's probably using a VW.
Yeah.
It kind of looks like it is.
Yeah, I'll talk about units in a little bit, but another thing when you see this go from like what you may assume is like a medium screen or a tablet size to a larger screen is that the font grows too. Now that we have more space, we want to use all of that space when we get there. Further down, we have another 3-column and a singular column, which will break into like a mobile top-down, probably with Flexbox, where we go from row to column view. But that breakpoint is a different size. I'm going to zoom out. That might work. It didn't. Yeah. So here we have like our 3 and our 3 here, and I think these are at a different breakpoint. Right. So these break fully across, or the component changes how it looks based off of where it fits on the screen, not where the entire page changes. So the first like big takeaway today is that you can make different components change how they look at different screen sizes. They don't have to use they don't all have to use the same breakpoint to get there. Okay, that's a Sparkbox website. It's great. It's really squishy. When we say squishy, it means that like it has responsive. It responds to the size of the window. It squishes and grows based off of the room it has. Components are like goldfish. They grow to take up the space they are given, right? This is PSA, another web property we worked on. I think this site, again, is very beautiful. It has lots of different components that take up different sizes on the space, side-by-side components, little grids. This has a 3 across, and like their footer is pretty large too. So I'm going to show you this website. Again, I'm going to use the inspector so I don't have to resize my window. First, look at the navigation. It's really common for when a navigation not to fit in the space it is anymore to then jump to a hamburger or menu drop down. And you'll notice that this breakpoint was chosen not because it's like a mobile or desktop website, but because like this is the smallest amount of space that this looks good all the way across. So we wanted to keep a little bit here. You learn about design hierarchy, you know that components that are grouped together should have relevant meanings. So we want to add a good amount of space between components that are not. So we want to add a larger space here than we add here so that this is treated as separate from this, but then it fits on the page, right? Okay, so again, we have all of these different components. You'll see like there's this block here, and then like this little blue block, and then like this list and some more 3-column pictures down here. This website will split them all at different sizes. So first, when this block gets too narrow to read, generally there's a comfort level width of reading. You'll probably notice this based off like an e-reader or lots of article websites. The text doesn't go fully across the screen because it's hard to read it. It makes your eyes tired when you have to look from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen and back and forth, right? So usually I get that number from a designer, but it's somewhere between like 30 characters and 60 characters.
45 to 75.
45 to 75. Just ask your designer what they want, but you won't.
There's a
constraint. Go ahead.
Just as a heads up, and I can give a link to this, there's a fantastic bookmarklet I use to, it will highlight in red the range to add that break in. And as I've added a little bit, what is fantastic is a unit called the CH unit. I think I've thrown something about this in dev before, but you can set it to just 60 CH and it will take whatever that character count is for your default font size in this space and cut it off at that point. So then you always have a legible line length.
Wonderful. So the first way we sort of decide when breakpoints should exist is when a component physically cannot fit in the page, like the menu. Another way we decide when breakpoints should exist is when text is no longer comfortable to read. So when this text here, you can see that the font sizes grows again here. And then when it starts getting too wide across the screen, it'll split into 2 columns. And then we are in that nice range that Philip just mentioned there again. But these 3 will break at a different point, I think. Pretty sure, because they fit in this is too small and they don't quite fit on the page anymore. It's starting to get a little cramped. And you may be like, Catherine, how do I know if something is cramped, or how do I know if it doesn't have enough space? Like, that's why we work with designers. That's why we have design reviews. Eventually you will probably learn some best practices. And the way I like to phrase like working in the front end and how to ask a designer a question is I make my best educated guess I can possibly get, and then I ask them for review. Screenshots in Slack are great. Casey started a wonderful conversation about this in our tech leads chat about design reviews lately. So ask your tech lead about like design review if you don't know what that is. Cool. So this is the PSA website. And I wanted to point out the footer too, because this is another like common thing on websites like this that have like a secondary navigation in the footer. They have just like gigantic footers and you want it all to fit and you want it to be legible. But if you make your footer too big in a mobile view, you just start scrolling forever, right? So I'm going to shrink this down. This is really nice because it does utilize a 2-column view and then the 3rd column and then a singular column and then it'll grow. So one thing you notice that I am doing on this is going from large screens to small screens because we are most comfortable looking at desktop designs. They're typically the first design you get. But when we're actually building, if you remember mobile first, we like to use min-width media queries and we like to start at the small screen. So if you're lucky and your Figma design has a mobile view and a desktop view, when you get it, you can build the mobile view first and then like guess how to get it to the larger version. but really like you kind of have to go back and forth, and that's that squishiness word again. So you like squish this up and down and make sure it looks good wherever the pixels land. All right, so again, I'm going to use the inspector. One reason I really like to use the inspector to move things around is that it will tell you the pixel widths you're at on the page.
Ooh. There's a fantastic bookmarklet that Tar made some time ago that needs some updates, but it is amazing. That will, and I'm sorry for the interruption, but it will show the screen width both in pixels and rims, but it will also list what breakpoints have been passed, so that you can drill down and find those things. I think it's Media Query Bookmarklet if you look at it up on GitHub.
Yeah, do that. I used to use it all the time and then it stopped working. Tar. I think he updated it though. All right, so this, our NCSBN navigation, you may have seen it a couple times. I think it is really wonderful. It's a great solution to this problem, and maybe not one that was explicitly designed this way. This is a priority plus navigation. So we want on the NCSBN website, it has tons and tons and tons of pages, all kinds of different things, but we want to figure out the most common. Now, this is a question for your UXer, if you, or your designer, if you have one of those on your team, which are the priority navigation element items, and we want to show those like normal, and then everything else will responsively hide behind the dropdown. So if I go to the NCSBN website on my cell phone, most likely I'm looking about NCLEX or like how to take a nursing exam. So that's going to be my first item here. And then there's a little JavaScript that if I make the screen just a little bit bigger, like, oh, my second most likely thing when I go to the website is going to be regulations. So now those pop up, but if not, I can go in the menu. And that just grows this way all the way until you get to the largest screen. So we do a lot of large navigations like this on properties like our higher education work, just things that where websites are huge and the navigation is big. So this is totally an option for solving that problem. So in the chat, I saw Ryan says, would you say that design influences when or where a component or section breakpoints should exist rather than a breakpoint system like a grid? Yeah, so I'm assuming that the question is like, a lot of websites are designed on a grid, whether it's like a 10 grid or a 13 grid, and every single line in the grid could be a different breakpoint, most likely like 600, 1200, something like that. If your page does have a very specific grid, you can round up your breakpoints up and down so that they match like a system. Now, most websites I feel like are informed not by design and not by a grid, but by content in your elements. So it's very important to have like good content in your components. So these titles here, one thing design, I guess it could be design. So like this nurse licensure guidance will take up 1 line or 2 lines or 3 lines. So this, I forget like the design term, but if this like 3-line words is stacked like this growing, connecting, regulatory, sometimes it looks weird when you have a short word and a long word. So I may choose to add a breakpoint so this never has nurse by itself on its own line.
Maybe I can elaborate. When you were describing when you included breakpoints or when breakpoints were included in sparkbox.com in the PSA, and you were saying, look, we're on the same page here, but when we have the 3 boxes stack versus be horizontal, when the section below it and how those breakpoints are different, it sounded to me like you were using what the design of those, independent of what the page situation was, the design of what those looked like in reality with content, actually, now that you're starting to talk about that, to decide when the breakpoint needed to happen, rather than predicting what are all the breakpoints for pages. And so instead you're saying it's the design that's dictating when I add those. I might have both, but like if the design doesn't look good, right? It doesn't matter what the system is. I need to do something else. Is that what you were kind of trying to show with your example there?
Yes, 100%. So when you are given, I have a Figma design here. This is Summer's beautifully designed apprentice project. And it is like a lot of design projects we get where you have desktop, where you have tablet, and you have a mobile. Now I have all three of these. So if I were to start building this website, I would build the mobile version of the website or my part of the website, because it's unlikely I'm going to be building this entire thing and then doing breakpoints. So I would build it out, and then like the tactic here, we're going to talk about it a couple different times, is to make your screen as small as possible and to slowly increase it. And as soon as the design breaks, that's when you call it a breakpoint. Now, there are the desktop and mobile versions of the website because this is really strong guidance. When you get around here, it should look about like this. For example, the gem icon moves. You may have like when this starts to look silly, or when you have enough space here, then that's when it'll move. So it is kind of like a roadmap, right? When you are at these specific sizes on the page should look like these specific sizes. But when you're in the middle, it doesn't have to jump from one entire design to another entire design. We're just going to kind of guess.
And one thing I'll add to that is your breakpoints really do not need to and probably should not be what is in the width of the page on Figma. So this one here, or maybe it was one below, said 1194. You don't need a breakpoint at 1194. You need to put a breakpoint where it changes to that layout. And that layout is probably going to happen well before 1194. Okay. Our breakpoints are based off the design, not a device. And the design is a fluid thing. And it's the thing about graphic design software is it's still very static in that approach. We're making progress in that we can start making some more adjustments there. But really what you all are doing is you're the people actually building out the design in the final medium of the design, the web. And that's where the design actually lives. These are ideas. These aren't directions. These are a guide. The real design, the true design, is what is in the browser.
I love that. This is what I'm glad you're here, Philip. And again, like it's designing in the browser, reading a Figma document. All these things are a learned skill, just like any language you're writing, except they're less structured. So pairing with a designer, pairing with someone on your team, like Casey or Anastasia or Patrick or John or anybody who's really good with front-end development, can help you work through this stuff and get better at it. But the designer is the person who's going to tell you if you're right or wrong at the end.
And I gotta say one other thing with this is, one of the things is just being a designer and working in the web. You can have all these great ideas of how something's going to look when you're in this ideal scenario of graphic design software. But once you're in the browser, you're going to see problems that wouldn't have existed otherwise, that you just wouldn't have really gotten. So that's one reason why I think an absolutely horrible term, and I hope everybody hears this, a horrible term in web design is pixel perfect. There's no such thing. It's absolute crap. It is something that just we get this mindset of like, oh, that's what perfection means. And perfection is not that. Perfection is what looks and feels right. And that look and feel will change as you actually see it in the browser, as there are things that are affecting that type of stuff. Sorry, got on a soapbox there.
Hey, I think it's fine. I wanted to show this article just a little bit about when we choose to add and hide content, because that's often a thing that we'll get either from a client designer or our designers, where something just isn't important on a mobile browser, so we're just going to hide it until we get to the largest screens. This is an article written by Philip, but we did not build the website, so I'm again going to open the inspector so we can make it squishy. And on the small screen, you'll notice that again, like this side navigation component, which is like an overview component, it jumps the different headers, which is honestly really cool. When we get to the smallest screen, that is in a drop-down menu, like we probably would expect this icon could be a little more open and aware, but again, you can still get to all that information by scrolling. So maybe it's not like as much of a priority when you're a mobile reader versus a desktop reader. You may not skip around as much. You may just like scroll through the page. Now, what you might notice is that related block is very front and center, the right side column on the larger screen, but I have to scroll through this entire article before I even see that stuff. I don't even know if this component exists on this page. And that was probably a UX decision because the related content is nice. It moves your user from your work to another work on the page. We do this on the Foundry. We like to keep people on our pages to move around. So this component has not been shoehorned into the very top of the page. It still gets right to the article. And then on larger screens, when we have the space to show it, it's a nice upgrade. And that's a little bit in the progressive enhancement phase of our world where, you know, something on a small screen doesn't have a nice thing like this, but as we have more space, we have more resources to allocate it to it, we enhance to get there. Now, that's not like the full heart of progressive enhancement, which is an entire talk for a different day, but you can see some of those things. But as a developer, I would be very, very careful when you choose not to present content on the page to your users or suggesting that, or if your designer is suggesting that. Make sure it's a conversation, make sure you're talking about the UX of it and the user. It's an easy solve in the browser, but it does mean that you get a different website, just like we want IE 11 or IE or Edge users to have the same experience that a Safari user does. We want a mobile user to have the same experience as a desktop user does. Lots of people are using their cell phones now, so it's just good practice. Okay, so I'm going to type in here so you can see these things. There are a couple different sizes of units or spaces. You know that rem, let's do it up here before it gets done. So like rem is our basic unit. It's the one we use a lot. Most of our websites say use this instead of pixels. If you're newer to the team, lots of other shops may use pixels, but we like to use rem. Rem is roughly worth to 1 unit of the base font on the page. If you set your base font by default, it's probably 16 pixels. So we just assume that like 1 rem equals about 16 pixels. And so if you have you're supposed to make something 400 pixels on the page, you can divide 400 by 16. So this is, so like 25 rem is about 400 pixels. And the reason we like to use rem instead of pixels is because of, like I said before, those different devices treat pixels differently. If you have a retina screen, a pixel is fundamentally different than it is on a non-retina screen. Because of pixel density, a rem bases it is a relative unit based off of the font size on the page. So a rem already by default is immediately responsive to the website. So if you want to practice with this and you have a responsive or a retina and a non-retina screen, like add a Codepen, fix something at a pixel width, fix something at a rem width, and see if it changes. So that's your first basic responsive unit. I like to use rems when I'm fixing widths. So if I want something to be very explicitly this size, I'm going to use a rem. I use rems a lot for like heights of things. And then so the next unit is an M. An M is also a relative unit to font size, but it's relative to the parent container, not the base font size. So a rem is going to be 16 pixels on your entire page. If your base font size on the body is 16 pixels, an M will be relative to the component. So like where this text says my main content block, it is like two rem font size. Yeah. 3 rem. So 1 M on this block is not the same as 1 rem. It's going to be actually 3 rem because the font size is, this is really confusing, but so So 16 times 32 or times 3 is 48. So that's about 48 pixels. I like to use M on things where the font sizes change. So if you saw on some of the examples, we had like a font size in a header that got larger. We'd also probably want the padding to get larger. So, or margin. So as the font gets larger, the space should also get larger. And those are where I like to use M. So rem is like for fixed widths, breakpoints, font sizes. And M is like margin padding. There are probably other areas where you will find a relative font size to a margin, to a text size to be helpful, but this is like the default for me. Another unit we use a lot in responsiveness is percent. And that's going to be a percent of the total width of the page. And that's not the screen size. It is the width of the total percent of the parent container. So if I have, for like, this is largely used in Flexbox. So if I have like a 60-40% container and I have like that, we actually saw one. Like this container right here is probably got a max width of something. And then like this container is just whatever percentage is left. This one might be 40%, and this just takes up whatever is left because it's a little squishy and it'll grow. Philip, did you have a comment?
Yeah, there's going to be one thing I was going to say. Well, actually two things. But percentage can also be used on font size, and it works differently when used on font size than being when it's width. It's one thing. When it's kind of some other properties, it can be something else. So it's really good for using on widths. If you start using it on other areas, it can get a little tricky and may not produce what you're expecting.
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I was going to mention, I don't remember if you had said this, Catherine, I had to step away. One of the reasons why it's really beneficial to use relative based units over pixel based units is pixels are actual physical things, and the computer responds to what those pixel physical things are. And that's a set value, whereas relative values can morph and change to the needs of the user. And one of the big reasons for this is there are two different ways to handle zooming a page in a browser. There is hitting Command plus and Command minus, which you all probably do pretty regularly, but then there's also changing the default font size, which actually drives the font size and scaling of a lot of other things. And that's why using rem and M especially are so valuable, because they have much more that they can do for these. It's basically it's accessibility and having that in mind. So,
yeah. Okay, I forgot to mention zooming, so that's excellent. The last unit I want to talk about, there are other units that are interesting, and I'm sure like the HTML and CSS Task Force channel would be an excellent place to debate units. The last one I want to talk about is for VH and VW, or viewport height and viewport width. The support on these is fairly good if you're not supporting IE 11. It does behave a little bit differently in some of the older IE browsers, but those are going away. So I would again use this as a progressive enhancement. Don't make it the sole reason your design exists, but definitely use it if you want to do things. Viewport height and viewport width units are equal to 1% of your current viewport. So the viewport is like the body of the page, everything inside. I was like trying to point at it. We're not in person anymore. Everything inside of this browser window here is the viewport. I think it changes in iframes and things like that. It's relevant to the container, but for the most part, it's the size of your browser screen. And it's 1% of that. So a really excellent use case that I have an example of a viewport unit is when you are on the Sparkbox website and you open up this little side window. It is now exactly, I can't scroll it. It's exactly the size of the screen. If I make the screen smaller, it's exactly the size of the screen. It covers it up top to bottom. Stupid website working correctly. So that it just is full width. So I like to use viewport units when I need like a modal experience or a web panel like this to take up the entire size of the screen. and respond to the size of the screen when I resize it. So those are excellent and can solve a lot of problems for you if you have them.
One other thing I'll mention, and this is just more broad Sparkbox things, but in a lot of projects we'll have variables set up in Sass for specific breakpoints. Those are, again, just like we were talking about the design, those are guidelines. They are not hard and fast rules of when a breakpoint should be used. It is kind of here's what we'd generally describe these as is you have multiple breakpoints and reasons for doing a breakpoint. So you have a breakpoint that is localized, and you have multiple things happening at the same time. So you're switching your small screen nav to a larger screen nav. You want to have a global big breakpoint that a lot of things are going to tap into for that. But then you're going to have other things that are going to be certain other events that are small but maybe connected. And so really you can have, honestly, you can have hundreds of breakpoints and breakpoint variables that all have different meanings and purposes. If you're only dealing with like 4, I would probably question the actual quality of the design that's kind of coming on out of there. There's probably places that really could use that fine tuning. However, I will say when we get into content queries being a thing, I think that's actually going to be probably more likely of what's happening is that we have multiple just have a few big media query breakpoints and then a ton of just small little content queries all over the place.
Awesome. Okay, Ryan has a question about line height. And I've mentioned it in Slack and around a little bit. But line height does take a unit, and most browsers it will work with a unit, but by default it is a unitless responsive thing. So just like rems are relative to the base font and ems are relative to the current font, line height without a unit is relative to the current font size. So that's a really excellent question, because if I go in here in Figma and I look at the line height, it's going to say 67 pixels. And we know, like, these panels in Figma are really useful a lot of times for like font weight, font size, those things, but sometimes it's just really not going to be great. So what we have to do here to calculate the actual line height is to take this font size and the line height and divide them. So if you have Alfred and didn't know, you can just type math into Alfred. You can't see it on my screen because I'm not sharing my full screen, but I'm not just like doing this math in my head. I'm doing it in Alfred. But if I take 67 divided by 55, I get 1.218. So my font size or my line height, where is this content? Oh, I think it is main.
And just my own opinion here, just go ahead and make it 1.2.
Yeah. So that is a unitless line height. It is 1.2 of the font size for the thing. We could do this with like 40 pixels and it'll look really different, right?
One thing to think about with line height, I'm sorry, Catherine, if I'm interrupting.
The line height that we use most of the time are 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. Like Philip said, I would definitely round those up because otherwise it's impossible to keep track of. Yeah, so you'll notice that like these change relative to the font size. And Philip, you can continue your point.
Okay. The thing I was just going to say is regarding a way to think about this. If you're in like Google Docs or some word processing thing and you change that line height of like to double height or 1.5, like that's what you're doing. It's the same thing. It's if you wanted this to be double height, you would set that line height to 2. And more often than not, something that just looks really nice for body copy is 1.5. 1.2 is really good for headings. And usually you don't see it too, like even 1.8, I don't see that too often as a size, but it would really depend on the font. Yeah. And again, I don't know. That's just the way I'd say to think about it. Anyway.
Awesome. First thing I would do is shrink my website down like this and be like, what's broken? And we might say, everything. This looks terrible, right? And none of you, except for Philip, are designers. And you probably all think like, hey, this looks kind of terrible. It's hard to read. The very first thing I like to do is add a minimum width. Codepen has one by default where it just won't get smaller than this. And if you are like on an Apple Watch or something, that ensures that you have to do a horizontal scroll. So I might say on my entire website, my min width is like 12 rem, something really small. And now I can't shrink it smaller than that, and we'll get that horizontal width. And that just like it proofs your website from breaking even at teeny tiny sizes, and you can kind of control that. That said, what else is broken? What should we fix next? Anybody?
Nav.
The nav, yeah. The nav is a really easy one. So usually at this font size, you would probably take the nav and make it an icon. But one thing you can also do here is just to like stack it a little bit nicer. So doing mobile first, we'll code it like this and then change it when we get higher. So list style type none takes the bullets off, but we can take off this display inline, I think. And then do like a font size or text align. My one weakness as a developer, I have many, but my biggest one is coding in front of people. So I aligned it to the right to make it look a little bit more pretty on the right side of the page. And I'm gonna add like a little bit of padding. So 0.5 rem. You could do M, but because it's the smallest font size, you can do it either. I should probably follow my own advice though. And do it this way. That's too big, 25. That looks pretty good. And when we do padding like this, it is on all sides. And we normally want our right-left padding to be controlled by the container so that everything stays nice and aligned. You'll notice like the header here is now misaligned with the content, and that's like a design note. So I would do top, bottom, 0. No, I would do right, left. Crap. I would do right, left, 0 so that the side padding is controlled by the container. Right, so that looks a little bit better. But if I make it larger, it's not going to change how it looks. It's just going to be kind of stuck there. And we have all this space, so I can kind of guess that it will fit probably about here. So that's what, like, I'm going to do a guess. So we're going to do our at media, min width. What did I just tell you about me coding live? Do like 40 rem. And we'll do display inline. This is how I code. Right, so now it looks good here, but we have this like weird middle thing, which makes me think that it's not ready yet, or that we have to do text align left. So this needs to be small, bigger. Yeah, right, so that looks a little better. And now I'm not using a variable for this. I just came up with it. It is very specific to this, this element. I probably won't use it again anywhere. And I can do that on every single component on my page. I can add more breakpoints in here. If I wanted the font size to get larger at like 60 rem, I can do font size. Breakpoints are free. Good. That's it. That's the TLDR. You can all play with this Codepen. A couple of things I would change is the padding size on the small screen. The font size very much needs to be smaller on the screen. The header text here could probably be smaller. Those kind of things. If you'll notice in the Figma, that's where you can use the Figma as a guide, because you'll notice like the font size is smaller here than here.